Hello and welcome to this episode of the Small Axe Radical Short Film Awards podcast. On this episode, I'll be speaking with Taylor Genovese about his film Under the Shadow of the Wall, which will be screening at our festival. Welcome, Taylor.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful. Taylor Genovese is an anthropologist and artist who works in film, video, photography, and sound. Taylor is currently completing his PhD at Arizona State University, where he is part of the Center for Philosophical Technologies and the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. He lives and works in the Hudson Valley, New York. So Taylor, I hope we can sort of start this interview just by asking a bit about how Under the Shadow of the Wall came to be made.
Sure, yeah. I first conceived of the film while I was working on a project at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State. And it was on a project that was trying to focus on a concept that my research group was playing around with called no place. And essentially, we were trying to catalog locations that yield a sort of ambiguity. Sites, for all intents and purposes, are modern and secular sites, but which tend to cover over disembodied modes of living, which it also then positively generates. That's kind of an academic ease kind of primer of that. So essentially what different scholars on the project were looking at were places like luxury condominium communities or restaurants in gentrified neighborhoods. But I was really interested in investigating whether this newly constructed border wall on the US-Mexico border could be, among many other things, one of these sites. And so at first I thought I would only do a photo essay, but then once I got down to that enormous grotesque structure, I knew that I would need to really produce a film, which is a medium that I think ends up being more visceral and sometimes more affective than just photos alone.
So you're sort of the border wall is obviously the main sort of character, if you will, within the film. And I was wondering, sort of the rhetoric of successive U.S. governments, almost to the point of it's been here for hundreds of years. They foreground the instability of the border regions, and thus the need for like hard wall borders. So I'm wondering, how far did that sort of rhetoric and that sort of prevailing sort of political climate mold your representation of the border in this film?
The rhetoric surrounding these kinds of unstable borders ends up being similar to the American military-industrial rhetoric of exporting democracy and stability, in that it ends up being just total bullshit, really, right? The United States is very, very good at manufacturing its own crises, and the southern border is one such site. So the supposed instability comes directly from the US itself, since before the 1970s, but especially in that decade. It began initiating through force neoliberal market reforms throughout much of Latin America. So some have pointed to the CIA-backed coup of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973 as a starting point. But of course, American colonial intervention is as old as the country itself. So the physical and economic violence wrought by the US has directly caused this migration north from people who have been affected by these American policies. And so then the building of this physical wall that was initiated by Trump and inspired by different walls around the world, primarily the Israeli state in Palestine, has put a degree of materiality to these otherwise more nebulous or sometimes immaterial policies and politics. And so it was that tangibility that I was interested in trying to focus on while representing the violence of borders in this film.
And so this violence that you're representing, you use an intriguing sort of genre conventions around the representation of the border walls. So you have the sort of sci-fi soundtrack and the sort of in some ways the sort of diary tone you take with the voiceover. It can sort of conjure ideas of sort of like someone reflecting back through apocalyptic visions that they had, or some type of journey they took. So I was wondering, within this sort of genre convention, what was your rationale behind the use of these?
Yeah. Well, the cheeky answer is that the wall itself really is straight out of a sci-fi horror
Mm-hmm.
dystopia, right? It is itself what the conventions are kind of being placed upon it, but in its scale, the way that it looks, the way that makes you feel standing next to it, everything. And I wanted to be able to try and demonstrate that. But really being in the presence of that structure evokes these feelings of being mortified and alone in the face of something awesome, right? And awesome in the true definition of the word. But the original score of the film was composed and performed by my colleague and production house partner, Dick Powis. And he really had free reign to kind of craft a soundtrack. And I think he did an amazing job. So as we were working together, Dick talked about really wanting to demonstrate these horror and sci-fi conventions of tension and texture, these things that we see. And he also really wanted to incorporate a lot of reverb, right, in order to kind of add this feeling of being in a big empty space. But that instinct, I think, was actually quite brilliant because, as he pointed out to me, the move to highlight this reverberation is actually quite counterintuitive because there is no reverb in an open desert, right? There's nothing for sound to bounce off of. But in this case, it really works quite well because the wall itself is the structure that is symbolically creating this reverb, right? And so the film wouldn't have been the same without his amazing work, and he's really to credit for adding this beautiful component.
So this is something maybe I haven't posed this question to you beforehand, but there was sort of some ideas I was thinking of. So hopefully I can pose these to you and we can have just a tiny discussion. The sort of idea of the alien came to me, and how the alien figures once again rhetorically within US political language. And I was wondering, maybe, how do you see this working within your own film, the idea of the alien?
Yeah, obviously the film is inspired by or uses quite heavily Mark Fisher's work, especially his work, the eerie, the weird and the eerie. And the alien is very much a part of all of that. I wanted to be careful while doing this, of course, because the word alien is used, weaponized even within American political rhetoric when discussing illegal aliens, right? Or trying to impose this word. And so I tried to be very careful to minimize or not use the word alien because of that, right? And so I was trying to focus on uncanniness more so than alien because of how loaded that term is and how inaccurate really that term is when describing populations of people and even describing environments like I was showing, because these environments, well, perhaps at first glance look very alien, is when you kind of take a more micro view of these landscapes, you really see that they're quite they're filled with vitality. They're not alien. They're very much down to earth, right? And I think that when you put it on a scalar level, you see that it's the same with people populations. And so trying to play with that, perhaps that concept of alien is where it kind of comes into this.
So this is actually a good segue sort of into the next question here, which is that obviously we're dealing with a border, but the border is situated within land that is obviously, I don't know whether to say pre-existent, but it's the land is there. And so my question sort of is, within this land, what sort of is the environmental and maybe sort of imperialist and colonial sort of implications and impacts of the border that you're trying to represent?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Lakin Jordal talks about in the film, my main interlocutor here in the film, other than my own voiceovers, the wall is incredibly devastating to the environment of the American Southwest, as you might expect. It's disrupted or cut off entirely migration patterns from many endangered species because the wall itself was built and didn't have to pass protections that are usually in place for the Endangered Species Act. And so it has threatened directly many species, including incredibly rare jaguars and ocelots that live in that environment. And so many species in this kind of in arid environments like the Southwest in the United States and Mexico depend on free movement through the landscape in order to find water and food. And so now many of these corridors now have a 20-foot steel wall blocking their way. And animals aren't the only ones, obviously, that are being cut off from their traditional lands. So one of the best examples is, there's many indigenous communities that are affected by this, but perhaps the one that is most glaring is the Tohono O'odham people, whose nation and traditional lands exist on both sides of the border in the U.S. and Mexico, and now they're having to face and navigate yet another colonial atrocity kind of inflicted on their people. And so this has taken the form not only of complicating their ability of moving freely within their own land, but also the mere construction of the wall has destroyed many sacred springs, many burial grounds, many other culturally important sites that exist on that land itself. And so land is very much especially to the indigenous populations in that part of the world, is on par with the people. And it's not so much a distinction between nature and culture as Western societies tend to kind of believe in.
So there was something interesting here, but when you also emailed me the links that we are going to post alongside your film to activist groups, which is that and your film touches on this, and you just said it, that the idea that's sometimes lost or sometimes not as well known is that Mexico itself is a colonial state, is a state that historically, and I'm not sure whether presently, but here you say presently, continue this sort of colonial project. So I've sort of lost my question, but it's something to do with so how far is this important to you? Maybe how far is it sort of expanding this colonial idea away from the US imperialism towards
it's difficult, right? Because US imperialism is so hegemonic throughout the whole world, right? It's something that it imposes on anything it possibly can. And so it becomes both nuanced to touch on. You have to be careful with it because you don't want to direct attention away from the US by saying, oh, well, look, Mexico is doing it as well, right? But then you also don't want to erase it. And the fact that the Mexican state and the Spanish state before it imposes many kind of racial atrocities on indigenous peoples within their nation, right? And these are the peoples that have traditionally occupied that land for much longer. And so you have this a similar tension in Mexico between lighter skinned Mexicans of European descent and darker skinned peoples who are from indigenous groups. And so that this kind of tension exists not only in the US, in other words, right? And so I wanted to point out that it's not just the fact that the border wall has been imposed upon Mexico, which it has very much so, and it deeply affects all Mexicans. But it's also important to understand through this the lens of the Tohono O'odham people who exist on both sides of the border and face many challenges from both states at once, that this is kind of a untenable situation that needs to be kind of focused on as well.
So we've come to the end of the interview here. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation together and your ideas. But to wrap up, I was wondering if there are any sort of projects, activist groups, or films you'll be working on within the near future.
Yeah, thanks. No, this is great. I could talk forever. I'm currently in post-production on another documentary I shot in Ukraine in October of 2021. So just 4 months before the Russian invasion of the country. And so That film is proving quite challenging to edit. It's obviously become a very different film, whether I like it or not, than
Mm.
the film I first envisioned it would be while I was shooting it. But at the same time, I think it has potential to become a very important film because it kind of captures life before this kind of vicious invasion.
Mm.
Um, I'm also developing an experimental narrative film with my brother, who's a brilliant writer and poet, and so I'm very excited to get started on that after coming off of two back-to-back documentaries. So those are a couple of things that are in my pipeline right now.
Brilliant. Well, all the best for those endeavors, and all the best for the future. Thank you very much, Taylor.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.